I want to welcome everybody to our virtual auditorium here. I'm so glad you were able to join us with our friend Emily Washings tonight. It's been a long time coming. We met Emily a few years ago when she was on the hunt for descendants of the Yakama Wars to interview, and heard her speak out at the Yakama Cultural Center at that time, and I thought, we got to bring this woman out here. So I want to get Emily on as soon as possible, but I've got some housekeeping things that I want to take care of first. I want to start our evening with an acknowledgement that we gather on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Since time immemorial, the Coast Salish have called Whidbey Island home and stewarded this bountiful land for millennia. We honor Coast Salish elders, their descendants, and future generations who continue their lifeways on and around Whidbey Island. Of course, our guest is not here in Coast Salish territory right now, and some of our guests, actually it looks like more guests than I thought, are not in Coast Salish territory right now, but we do want to extend our respects to the Yakama Nation, where our speaker currently is. So for those of you who are not familiar with historic Whidbey or even Whidbey Island, I just want to quickly give you a little orientation here. Whidbey Island is right in the middle of the Salish Sea. And if you look at the map in a new way, without that European rigidity of north always at the top, you can see that where that star is, Whidbey Island, is right in the middle of one of the great waterways of the West, the Salish Sea, where the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound all converge together, as well as three major river systems that outlet right on the east side of Whidbey Island. So this is going to have obviously great importance, this location, to people all throughout the Coast Salish world. Those river systems don't only bring down river communities to salt water, but they also go over the passes to connect eastern and western Washington. So nobody's going anywhere without going through Whidbey Island here. This is just a sampling of the Coast Salish peoples that live within our little waterway here. And all of them would have a hard time navigating to visit neighbors and relatives without coming through Whidbey Island. So where we are, Penn Cove, was actually considered a real hub, a kind of a native Manhattan. Very important, and European explorers who came in the 18th and 19th centuries said it was the most densely populated communities they came upon anywhere in the Salish Sea. Our Charles Wilkes, American Charles Wilkes, wrote that upon the whole, the tribe inhabiting Penn Cove are more advanced than any others in civilization. So we're in a real hotspot here in Coupeville. Our little town. When you look out over Penn Cove today, though, you would never know that this place used to be such an important place to Native peoples. It is invisible to the naked eye. The Haller House, which is a historic property that we have purchased, sits right on the waterfront looking out over Penn Cove. And so we hope that it's going to have a good future, allowing us to shed light on the really important stories that are buried invisibly in Penn Cove to European eyes. So just to give a quick overview, Historic Whidbey, we are a preservation organization committed to the protection, preservation, and promotion of historic sites on Whidbey Island through education and advocacy. And that includes the stories that come with those places. So we're not just talking about saving places or buildings, but we are committed to saving the stories that come with those places. The picture that you see on the left is the Granville Haller House, built in 1866. I think Emily will be talking a little bit about our favorite colonel here during the presentation. This house is currently under rehabilitation, and our hope is that it will become a real public heritage center where people can come and learn and discuss the really complex issues that surrounded American settlement in the Northwest. These are, it was a troublesome era. Granville Haller was in the midst of all of it. And we're hoping that his house can do duty to help understanding and reconciliation. So if you're interested in what we do, you can visit us on historicwhidbey.org, or you can email me there at historicwhidbey@comcast.net. My phone number is there. I invite you to come and check out what we are about, what our vision is. And if you care to help support us, we're happy to have you do so. I'd like to take just a quick second to thank all the people who made donations when they registered for this event. It really helps to keep this vision moving forward. So I really appreciate it. So that is the end of my little show, which brings us to the best part. It is with great joy that I get to introduce Emily Washings. She is a scholar and an enrolled member of the Yakama Nation. Her lineage is Cree and Skokomish, and she has been involved in research for quite some time, which includes the Yakama Wars, Native women, in particular, murdered and missing Indigenous women, traditional knowledge, resource management, fishing rights, food sovereignty, quite a lot. She also has a deep interest in higher education, especially among diverse and tribal communities. And she is very active in that world. She holds a bachelor's in political science and in public policy from Central Washington University. And she has a master's in public administration from Evergreen State College. So she's got a lot of good letters after her name. And she is currently an adjunct faculty member at Yakama Valley College. So we are so proud to have her here to talk to us tonight. And I invite you all to join me in welcoming Emily Washings.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and to everybody at the Haller House connected to that, their volunteer or board. It's definitely a different topic to really delve into and perspective. So, elevating these voices, elevating this and acknowledging, the Native people of this land is so important. And I am just glad to be here and see so many people, even international and local, joining us today. I have a PowerPoint just because I'm a very visual learner. And sometimes when you listen to history or technical information, it could be very difficult to follow the train of thought without some kind of visual. So I'm going to share my screen with that. I'm going to have a presentation about 40 minutes, and then I'm going to ask for your insight, your questions. We'll have our tech person, Christian, monitoring the chat to help us along with that. And also, I'm going to invite Lynn to give some insight at the end, and then I can take a little bit of a water break. So I just wanted to give a little bit of the outline. And if your questions pop up while I'm talking, feel free to put it in there and we'll get to it. So, today the intention is to just really share this history and highlight an ongoing crisis that still connects us to the events that triggered the Yakama War of 1855 to 1858. How does historical events connect to an ongoing crisis? And how does Haller's role in all of that connect to validating Native history? These are something that and questions and rabbit holes that I've been going down for the past 7 years. I had thought about how long I've been looking at this and researching this and reading all these different books. And I kept thinking, has it really been 7 years that I've been on this hunt, as Lynn said, for descendants of the Yakama War that fought against my ancestors? And it certainly has. And I invite you into that journey with me, a little bit random, a little bit fun, and of course, a little bit triggering. One of the things that I appreciate Lynn's documenting all of my LinkedIn credentials. I I was like, wow, Lynn, I should have just recorded that and played that every time I enter a room, every time I enter the gas station, I'd like read off my degrees. But sometimes you don't really take as much stock in that, but having credentials and that still pursuing a pathway that is true to yourself, that recenters those things that you value is so important, even when talking about war. And, for me, it was very hard for me to transition from researching about a historical war that my ancestors were in to, now I'm going to make dinner for my kids. Now I'm going to play. And through that process and this pathway, I found that writing poems really helped me in that process. And I share this all the time because I have a life coach. I think about the processing of feelings quite a bit. And I invite anybody that's in this work, that hears this presentation to, have those own processes for yourself, whether it's going to go for a run or a walk after hearing triggering things. I think it's so important. So this is one of the questions I get asked so often is, why are you researching this? Where did this come from? And, one big part of it stems from a promise I made to my elders. And so this is a poem that I wrote that connects to that period of time. They sang a warrior song for her. This teenage girl stands with a new crown, side by side her elders. Step on stage with hopes and dreams. Hundreds of tribes watch. They sang a warrior song for her. Her heart goes boom, boom. Her breath slows as she wonders what it means when the elders sing you a warrior song. Questions ring through her head. They joke. We heard pageants are tough, like battlefields of our people. She smiles and releases the question. They lean closer. There is another reason to be told. Never forget the role of women in this tribe. She braces herself for cooking lessons, for how to find a good They say, Yakama women were in the wars. She blinks. They continue on. We want you to remember this message. She carries this with her crowns. How should she talk about war? Is this why pageant girls say world peace? Years have passed. These elders have too. Even though she has more to learn, she uses her voice. They sing a warrior song for her and women who lack ancient acknowledgement. So that's something that happened when I was 18. And, the way that knowledge passes with our elders is a very special thing, and our tribal members. And sometimes they choose to do it when hundreds of tribes are watching you on a stage. And, that's been one way that it really held true to me. And, something else that I've really pushed for is including my poetry and my writing, my scholarly writing, my case study that's open source. It's published within there, as well as a forthcoming article from in the magazine Evergreen State College has coming out, their anniversary edition. Okay, I always have a slide that talks about knowledge because some of this can be a little bit disorientating. I didn't realize that whole process of learning and knowledge until about the 8th grade, when I would just write different things and add different perspectives, even if it was our own tribal perspective. And my teacher kept writing back, you need to explain what it is you're saying. You need to explain what this means. And that's the point I realized, that they don't know what natives know about the land that we live, about the resources that we've had a relationship with, about the history of this land. And in my mind, I assumed they're the person that is teaching me. They're the person that's went to college and has all these books and access when, I have to go to all the outlet malls to try to find the books that I want and beg my parents for it. And so that's the point I started to realize that, there's an oral history amongst our people that isn't always readily accepted by Western society. It isn't always shared by tribal people because of a distrust, because of they don't feel credentialed enough sometimes, or there's, just distrust. And, I talk about this because I also make a very good point, and that connects to Lynn's land acknowledgement is, really when we tap in and listen to Native voices, we're really tapping in and listening to a data set that stretches back thousands of years. And if you're ignoring that voice, especially with resource management, with wars that we were in, what information do you have in your hands? And what information are you ignoring? What information don't you have access to? And if you're in that period of time where you're realizing and coming to a realization that you haven't had access to it, you haven't heard it, there's going to be a range of emotions. I see this with my students all the time. At first, it's kind of a silent nod. And then it's like, why haven't we heard about this? Why don't I know about all the different salmon species that used to be in the river and run up? Like, why weren't we taught these things? It's kind of a little bit of a outrage. And so I have this here to share with you just to acknowledge that and, identify that there are limitations, or what's viewed as limitations, to my research and voice, and that voice of my tribal people. We don't always have photo documentation of what we talk about. And we don't always have white historians, non-tribal historians, to authenticate our tribal knowledge. We will, if an elder has said that and has passed that knowledge down, we take that as the highest credentialed person in our tribe is telling us and sharing with us a history that's been passed down for generations. It's not something that we question, it's something that we hold on to. And all of this can be a little bit unsettling to people that are, experiencing this for the first time. And I especially add this for this question. And the reason why is a majority of historians would disagree with how I answer this question. Who started the Yakama War? And the reason why I have and make those statements is because the Yakama War started with violence towards Yakama women. When the white miners came over the pass and were headed up north to the Colville area, they raped and murdered Yakama women and children. Now, what other historians take, and the point that other historians have, is they start after that period of time. And I'll get into that in a second. Also, that beadwork was done by my mother, Stella Washings. I love to have beadwork as imagery with some of this because, it's a very triggering topic, but when you can celebrate Native art, it's a wonderful thing. So there is a historical account of the Yakama War by Alex Saluskin. It's referenceable if you just Google it as well. Different people have uploaded it. It's an account that I have had since I was a teenager. We've heard bits and pieces of this historical account growing up from different sources in the tribe, but he had it written and transcribed. And I'll read the English version. Whenever I read the Native version, I always cry. I always cry. And so I read the English version in presentations for that reason. And I do have this narrated in my short film, The Yakama War Ayat. They have killed the wife and his daughter of a baby in a board of Moosh Hill. And then Moosh Hill and two of his friends killed those white people, the murderers. So this is him talking about the family of this man who lost his wife and children to minors, going and making sure that violence didn't occur to anybody else. Now, at this period of time, there were laws that protected the white miners. There weren't white laws that protected natives. We had just signed the Treaty of 1855 in Walla Walla. Different tribes signed their own treaties at one of the largest treaty councils at Walla Walla. but it had not been ratified, right? So we even had bureaucracy and red tape and process way back in 1855. And the treaty wouldn't be ratified, for several more years. And during that time period is when we had the Yakama War. So it is a very interesting dynamic to think about. If you have the treaty that was signed but not ratified yet by Congress, whose law are you following in this land then? And what process do tribal members have when their family members have been murdered? It brings us to this, point about what was the reaction that came, what came about in this time period in Washington. After defending attacks on our Yakama women in 1855, the Olympia pioneer and Democrat said Yakama should be rubbed out, blotted from existence. And that's a genocidal statement. It's really hard to see that the act of protecting our families is viewed as an act of war. And it's really hard to study it and research it and say it as a Native woman. But I've went and said it all the way to the previous presidential administration, as well as the FBI. I've asked them about this, about, our first reports of murdered Yakama women were in 1855, and how the United States has yet to address that fact that they started a 3-year war with us as a result. Now, who helps support this information? We have this Native information. We have this information from different sources that we can review and look at, numerous books that have bits and pieces of it. And we also have Haller. Now, it might seem really weird that my take on this, and I've been so interested in so many different rabbit holes of Haller, but he just struck me as somebody that really searched for truth. He was a known Indian fighter, right? And, once upon a time, he was a major at that time in 1855. So that's how I'll reference his title, but, he was a colonel in the end. Major Haller was a known Indian fighter, was sent from Fort Dalles, Oregon to the Yakama Valley, but was surprised to find the numbers of Yakama and other Native American warriors were higher than he anticipated. Even with the newspapers calling for every Yakama to be killed, Haller continued to ask these questions. Why were so many Yakamas upset? And how could they amass so many numbers of people so quickly? His questions and truth-finding helped validate Yakama historical accounts, yet most history books continue to bypass a crucial historical fact about who started the Yakama War. One of the history books that does, and researcher is Joe Miles, and he has a book, Mayakan Country. I'm not sure if he's with us today. I didn't see his in the chat, but he's somebody that has, summarized some of the Haller journals, because I haven't been able to go and look at those journals in Seattle myself. And so I'm very grateful to him for sharing this information. So why would he do this? Why would he ask these questions? This is something that has gone through my mind so many times in 7 years. And it's really important as a researcher and this avenue and this way that I take it, to say that when we look at wars, when we look at Indian wars, when we look at this history, a majority of people that are public about it have a very us versus them mentality, right? And sometimes it's very hard not to be in that place when I'm researching it, because it's like these were people that were attacking my ancestors. These are people that were at war with them. It is very easy to have a us versus them mentality at some point, or even it would be easier to continue it. But I'm very curious and I get very interested about things. And so when Joe had shared with me that, the year after the first battle at Toppenish Creek, in which he had marched up from the lands to really, tell us Yakimas and really share, how the United States is going to run things with those natives. That he was surprised to see that amount of natives. Why were they so mad? And he began asking people. And what he heard was about the violence towards Yakama women. And what it said that he's journaled is the Yakimas were justified in their actions against me. The Yakimas were justified in their actions against me. Why isn't that cited more in history books? Why isn't that in the different Wikipedias and different things about the Yakama War? Why is that truth telling not amplified? Why do they say the Yakama War started with Yakama's killing of minors and erase Native women and violence towards Native women? When we look at this pattern, when we look at these different historical facts, we see a pattern that has continued from historical times to present day times. When we look at this long-standing silent crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, we can see patterns in history. We can see different things shine through. And what Haller really did was, help journal that. When he heard that, he had asked his wife, Henrietta, to send his journals up from Oregon to Yakima. And I think that's a really important little note to have about the role that women have in holding information. Even a she was, in those times in 1855 to be able to, send your husband's journals up into another from Oregon Territory to Washington Territory. It's a very different period of time. And I always like to acknowledge women's roles, whether they're Native or non-Native, in holding information. She could have been like, you know what, dude, I got a lot of stuff to do. I got laundry, I got meals to make. I don't got time for your journals. That's going to be on the bottom of my stack. And I think of her having a role in this as well. I think of them both and all helping validate this Yakama history. We had, in talking about this war, I'm going to go back to the slide about the Yakama War. When we talked about the war and how we sent messages to so many people and let them know what was going on, we used fire as a way to communicate with other tribes. And the other day, when we were driving, my husband had talked about something that my father shared with him. My father was in the Vietnam War. And he one of his roles and other natives' roles was that they would put them at the end and towards the areas, and they'd fly so that they could smell fire. Like being genetically predispositioned to be able to smell and sniff out fire, is so ingrained in us that they utilize this now even in, this 1970s war. And that's something that I, just recently became aware of. I've been studying this for some time, and my dad didn't think to share that with me at all until he shared it with my husband. And I'm glad for that message. It's something that I've been thinking about in the past couple of days, about this strength of being able to have messages that were shared with different tribes on the west side through fire, like to ask for for their help. And, they know the reason why. But the issue that comes up and the issue that we're still dealing with, and that is so heartbreaking and is something that it just keeps me up at night and I toss and turn, is that they criminalized our men. They criminalized our people for standing up and defending our Yakama women. It's hard to kind of take that look at things and see how the impact that it's had on our people about wanting to speak up, wanting to say that's not okay and that's not right. When you've been criminalized for 165 plus years for defending your women, there's a reason why it's called, the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis has been called a silent crisis. I'm going to go back to Howler Journal. So, my goal is to eventually go and look at the Howler Journal in person and, see that and be close to that. But again, I'm grateful for author Joe Miles for sharing the information with me and doing all those trips and me just taking and looking at all his notes and sharing it with you today. When we talk about Howler and how he's validated this information, we also look at, I talked about patterns. There's an ongoing targeting of Yakama women since that period of time. When we have extraction of resources, we have extraction of gold, we have how do we target now Yakama women for the land that they have. This 1910 article was shared in numerous states throughout the nation that say, dusky maidens are in demand. And this details how a man can marry a Yakama woman and obtain her land. So acknowledging and thinking about how Yakama women have continued to be targeted is an important part of this historical perspective. I also like to, I gave a lot of credit to Joe, and I also like to say, well, why did nobody want to listen to me? I tell you, a lot of people, when I first started talking about the war, this is not something that was readily quotable. I wasn't somebody that was quoted on it. I wasn't somebody that got calls back about it. And, presentation offers weren't pouring in like they are now, but they weren't pouring in. And I kept wondering, why does nobody care what I have to say about this? Or is this not something that people think about? Or so then I started thinking, how many Yakamas has anybody ever heard from about the Yakama War? And so I have all these fancy degrees. I can do limited studies and look and see. And the Yakama Herald, since its beginning in 1889 to 2018, which is the local paper here in the Yakama Valley, quoted the Yakama historical account of the Yakama War 5 times. And as you can see, those are all in 2018. I included one in 2019, but they're all mostly in the recent times. And those were my quotes. So when you think about, where is this voice? Why haven't we heard this Native perspective before? It's because we are not authenticated. We are not listened to. We are not quoted in different establishments until very recently. There's federal policies that have been in place specifically that have prohibited or tried to prohibit us from practicing our culture and religion. So if those are in place, then we're not allowed to speak our language. We're removed from our homes to forced assimilation boarding schools. Are we going to be like, oh yeah, and guess what happened when we were at war with the United States? No, that's not going to be information that is readily available, and it's not going to be something that they seek out from us. So I always make this point, and usually they're always in the room, and I kind of have an awkward glance towards them. But and if they're in the room now, I know you've done better, Yakama Herald, but I do like to share this because there's a reason you haven't heard this perspective before. So who was quoted? Who has been out there? Who has gotten the information? Howler and his, asking his wife for the favor to send the journals wasn't quoted on this in large articles. We have Hiram Crabtree. So there's incorrect information about the start of the Yakama War that is cited as fact. However, his father never lived in Yakima or Washington. So it further contributes to the erasure of MMIW and our Yakama women that were violated. They just made it up and said they started the Yakama War, and then they got quoted in the Yakama Herald. And who shared this with me is Hiram Crabtree's relatives, present day relatives. And one of the things they said is, it strikes me as odd that they just got quoted, and what they said got quoted as fact. Nobody thought to look it up. And I thought that was really interesting too. I was like, wow, can I see it? And I was like, there it is. So these are just different examples of, who's not getting quoted and who is getting quoted. And now that I've really revved you all up in fifth gear about history, I do have humor within my work, including in my short film. I was unsure about how to approach a stereotype that exists and that is reiterated, quite frankly, in numerous studies, that natives are evil and hostile. If you have a book on the Yakama War and you open it up, paragraph 2, paragraph 4, I guarantee it's going to have something that talks about the evil and hostile natives. And I really struggled with how to have a pathway to address this through a film. I originally had a grant from the Evergreen State College Longhouse to have a short film. And every time I wanted to address this, it felt like I was fighting, like I was arguing it, like I was defensive, and it didn't ever feel right. And so I thought, I'm going to try to find a way to agree with them. And so what is the most evil and hostile I've been in my most recent time? And I remembered this Maleficent picture from Halloween. And my husband, I don't think he knew my picture of him as a zombie eating a fake gummy foot was going to be in a film, but that it made it too, because I was like, well, he looks hostile. I look evil. So it's a good pair. 19 years together. That's what it takes. No. He's also Yakama. And that's how I finally settled, on addressing this stereotype. Maybe it's not for everybody. Obviously, maybe somebody else would choose to address it, somebody else, but there are other people's biases in history. When you research and read this, you're gonna find it. And it's so important to find a pathway that gives you a sense of peace. It's so important when revisiting war stories, war accounts. So, once I felt settled about things, I feel like there's different curiosity elements that kept opening up. I kept wondering, did your relatives fight in the Yakama War? I was so interested in if our Yakama relatives' historical accounts aren't taken as seriously, what do the descendants say? Do they still feel the same way their relatives felt at that time period? Or do what do they think? What were they told? And I really wanted to push this question. I mean, I even would ask it in the cereal aisle. I would ask it in jury duty. I'm like, hey, did you happen to know if your relatives fought in the Yakama War? Most people were like, when was the Yakama War? they didn't know this period of time in history. They don't know like why they pull off at that rock, that's right out in Union Gap, and it's a historical war marker. They don't know about the number of battles and the impact that's had. And a lot of people asked, why are you searching for descendants? Why are you, and even if you, which it's going to be like finding a needle in a haystack, what makes you think they're going to want to talk to you? Which really struck me. Like, I just think like, well, I have a conversation with them. I'm not coming at them in any way. I'm curious. I wonder what stories have been passed down. I'm betting that there's some elements of oral history with them or some sentiments, and I did find that. And I did find it with a number of people. One of the stories that an individual from the, I won't say the area because they want to be anonymous, but they had said that it's a story that they tell when their family gathers. And they talk about his relatives were in the, both in the militia and the military. They talk about coming from Oregon and they're going to get those Yakamas, and they come up and they look all over this land. It's some of it is dry, some of it's very different. A lot of, differences from maybe where they had come from. And they'd started running out of supplies. So then they had to go home, and it was dark. And he said, and when it got dark, all they could hear as they were walking along are the Yakamas laughing and echoing all their way, so much of their way home. And I thought, see, this is the kind of stories that are important to record and know. these are the kind of stories that illustrate that we did not want to just go out and be evil and hostile and take lives for no reason. We kind of just laughed at them for trying to come and kill us and not being aware of the area or anything, and then running out of supplies and not finding a single Yakama in this whole time. When I heard that story, I was grateful for that. I always think and reflect on how we even utilized humor even in war, even during war times. And I also, again, think that's so important not to have this us versus them mentality constantly towards us. When I stand side by side, the relatives of the people that fought against my relatives, it makes people think and open up a different way about things. It adds and brings other people into this curiosity element. I have young children, 11 and younger, and I see it every day on their faces, and I just wonder sometimes why and how did adults get so many hard lines and boundaries on what we allow to learn about, what we allow ourselves to learn about and acknowledge. And so by meeting some of the descendants, I think it really helps. And, I happened to be at Fort Walla Walla Museum, and I asked, hey, do you know any descendants of the Yakama War? And the first thing they said is, why do you want to know? They're very scared. I don't know what they thought I was going to do. But Steve Plucker, is somebody that their great grandfather was Private Charles Plucker in the 9th U.S. Army Infantry at Fort Simcoe. And I put on here 1859 originally because I had said the war stopped when they ratified the treaty. And I really tried to push that point again and again and again. And a lot of people are like, nah, it stopped in 1858. So I haven't fully let go of it, but I usually reference the 1858 because I need to make that point about the treaty being ratified, I feel like, which most people don't know that is an element of the process. So this is a slide that I made before I changed it, but it reminds me that I still have hope about some things that I believe that maybe others might eye roll at. So Steve Plucker, when he called, we became, we talked. I remember the first conversation we had, it was very natural and conversational. I was taking my kids to a class, actually. I wasn't driving. I was in the passenger seat and my husband was driving. And I just remember being like, I found the needle in the haystack, and there was like a news report about it. And from there, other descendants started coming forward. And I'm always grateful for Steve, sharing that insight and having that, I don't want to say courage. I'm lost for the word of that is. But the belief in honoring the history and perspective of Natives and willing to stand by my side when I share that. Maybe there's not a complete agreement. Maybe there's obviously not the same perspective, but he stood by my side during a presentation when I went back to Fort Walla Walla to talk about the Yakama War. And that's where this picture was taken. And I'm actually, I think 7 months pregnant in this picture. And it was a big moment for me. I haven't yet met a descendant of Howler, which has been a 7-year item on my to-do list, my bucket list. Another person I met is the descendant of Glen Hamilton. And in this picture, what I always think is really interesting that Glenn pointed out to me is that there is a picture of a Bible. He's holding a Bible in the center. And on his pin is a Veterans of Indian Wars. Or on his jacket is a pin that is a Veterans of Indian Wars. So I really think that's such a unique and different thing to have. And I really didn't know what fully to think of this, Suplina Hamilton is his name. at first, but I continue to try to approach this with an open mind. I have to always recenter like on an open mind. Different feelings might come up about it. But it's important to get that information, that I try to have that perspective. And what was shared with me is that after Supplina had, you know, been in the war, that the tribe, Umatilla tribal members came and gifted his family with 10 yards of red ribbon for their new baby, which I thought was so interesting. About even after we were at war with people, that there could be some level of connection, you know. And I think the reason why people are so surprised, even my chiropractor is like, I can't believe you study the war. You seem so happy and optimistic. And I just think I don't always like the way that it's depicted. I don't like the way that people are depicted when they're in war. I feel like there's more human connections than it is always shared. I feel it's my duty to try to find where those connection points are. It's something that has spoken to me. And so Glen and I, just because we seem to be on the same rabbit hole pathway, different descendants are quite frankly at different points of their processing of their relatives' role in the Yakama War. And some of them, you know, and they range. Some of them are just matter of fact, oh, I didn't know much, that's this. And to very angry about it. And I always think that's very interesting, but Glen and I seem to be on very similar processing pathways. And so we had been pen pals for a year. And then PBS had asked, you know, hey, would you be interested in having a film about, I think they wanted to have my kids drawing or something like that for an upcoming Native American series. And I thought, yeah, I could, you know, they could do that. My kids draw, they're animated. I was like, but what if I met a descendant of the Yakama War on camera for the first time? And I hadn't talked to Glen about it at this point, but that's how I pitched it. And of course, there's all these, you know, meetings that the producer has to go to on their side, because they originally had a drawing and now they're trying to have descendants of the Yakama War meet, which is, you know, way different. And, you know, eventually they agreed, and Glen and I met, and our families met on camera for the first time. And this is the picture by Lynkhan of Glen and his family and my daughters. My husband, John, daughters Alice and Zora. My son, Jared, was 3 at this time, and we just knew his attention span and everything. We knew that it would be very difficult for him. But you can find that video through KCTS9. The producer, Jen, was great, as well as, you know, the film crews. In the moment we met, you know, I remember what's not on camera. And I remember that I looking out and seeing the film crew crying. And I just thought, I wonder why they're crying. I don't, you know, you don't take things in all the time as it's happening, but, you know, I reflect back on that moment and kind of a testament to what and who we can be as people. You know, the connections that we can build even after we have had a shared history that includes war. And, you know, I think back to this moment quite often, and my kids talk about it every so often as well. I do have a case study. It's open source. For those of you that don't know what open source means, it means there's no paywall. You click this link, the case study goes right to a Word document. It also has teaching notes. And my case study that I published with the Evergreen State College Native Cases is called War Cry: Will Crossing Historical Boundaries in Indian Wars Help Yakama Women? I talk about this process of reconciliation and what that means to me, and what that means to meet descendants and search for descendants of the Yakama War. And I also have this big question is like, will that even help Yakama women in this ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women? It's still open. Did I follow a completely wrong pathway in bringing this forward? And should I have been doing X, Y, Z? I'm not actually sure. I consider myself a lifelong learner, and I know that there'll be things that I learn as this progresses. But I do know that it's been such an amazing process for me to have people open up and to kind of stay as true as I can to my values and my teachings in this. This beadwork is also by my mother, and that title I changed about 20 times, and I couldn't settle on encompassing everything that I had. But to me, War Cry speaks to such a balance of strength and vulnerability. And that is the balance and the range that I take on it. There's both strength and vulnerability in this entire process for me. And I have to be really attuned to when it's really on one side more than the other. And of course, you can learn more about me at nativefriends.com. I also host a podcast with 3 other Yakama women called War Cry. And I did have one more thing to say about Glen and his family. And when we were at the end of filming, he asked, where should we go from here? What do we do now? And I said, let's ask for a correction to that 1910 article from the Yakama Herald. And he was like, oh my gosh. And so, there's pictures of us laughing and him going like, oh, and they were technically supposed to be stopped filming, but, really good photographers and cameras, they'll take as many candidates as they can, even if you're done. And that was that moment. And I'm glad they got it because it just captured that sense of like, well, let's try it. Let's see if they'll publish it. And it took a long time. The editor sat on it for a few months and different people kept asking. I kept asking and I was like, man, they really don't want to issue this correction. They don't want to, even in an opinion piece. But they eventually did. We asked for that correction to that article and we made the point. And I think that's an important part in this journey is to, try some things and ask some questions. So on that note, I want to invite Lynn to share any insight on what I shared as it relates to the Howler House, and then we'll get to some of the questions and other insight from our wonderful audience.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was delightful. And I just want to say how much I admire the work you're trying to do. And you were a little bit ahead of your time, considering that we are all now reevaluating how we tell history in the last couple of years in particular. It's so important that we just almost not tear the house down, but go in under the drywall and under the plaster and into the basement and pull out all those voices that haven't been heard before. So I am glad you are there doing it. And I am glad that you found us because our Indian killer had the good grace to write something positive about what he saw. And I believe that you are correct in I've read some of those things at Special Collections and University of Washington, Howler's writings. Beyond his journal, he also wrote memoirs of his time in the Yakama Wars from his elder years, so 30 years later. And he was clearly trying very hard to be fair. You can't whitewash historical perspectives. He still believed that the great American Republic was destined to spread from ocean to ocean. But he certainly thought that the Yakama in particular were getting a rotten deal. Most specifically, he thought that Congress not ratifying the treaties in a timely manner made sure that the prospectors and the settlers had no law. that they were bound to honor. There was a huge divide between the U.S. Army and the militias in their attitudes to how they should be behaving. And the militia thought that the U.S. Army was too kind, and the U.S. Army thought that the militia were too savage. And so his writings that are unpublished are a really interesting perspective on that. And Joe Miles, I think this is a quote from Joe's book, but also from Haller's memoirs. He said that we must admit that the Indians of Washington and Oregon are entitled to some commendation for their patriotic spirit in resisting the tyranny of civilization, as our revolutionary fathers were in resisting the tyranny of royalty. For we find they were loyal to their Indian customs and rights, fought for them, were individually brave, but lacking the cohesion of discipline and the materials for war, they had to yield to the iron hand of destiny. And that is pretty representative of the way Haller viewed his experience and what he observed during the Yakama Wars. So a very interesting guy.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Sure. What, do we have questions here?
I'll read them off now. The first question was from Jennifer Ott. It says, it sounds as though you try and make room for the white descendants versions of the war stories. Isn't it very hard to make room for these stories when they're based on so many false premises? Or are we at the point where we just, it's just important to hear their versions and understand how they understand the war?
I think there's some element of seeing what's out there. You know, for me, I view it as an Alice in Wonderland, going down rabbit holes and seeing, where does this pathway lead? Where does that one lead? Why do they hold that perspective? You know, I'm very curious about those elements of it. And I think that I have the privilege now of knowing descendants of the Yakama War and knowing the emotions that they hold and sentiments that they hold towards me and my family. There are still people that have different positions and a very us versus them mentality in the Yakama Valley. Meaning a few years ago, there was EMTs that had been commenting about Yakamas, and they had publicly, you know, on social media stated, well, we should have just killed them all off during the Yakama War. These are people that service our Yakama tribal members. These are people that went and picked them up in ambulances and were in charge of their care. And this is the sentiment and feeling that they're holding, and they're using a misguided position in history to, you know, amplify their position and view of natives, when the descendants of those people that fought that, the ones that I've met, have never shared that viewpoint towards me. You know, and I think about the rage and outrage that was felt from numerous people from this valley at hearing that and seeing that. And I thought, you know, I have something settled inside me, because I know that the descendants of the Yakama War, that's not information that was passed on. War is difficult. It's a difficult position. Some people were immigrants and they were taken off the boat and said, you know what? You're going to go to Washington Territory and you're going to fight some natives. And that's what you're going to do. Yet when they passed away and they died, they journaled about it and said, I want to be buried next to the Yakamas. I want to be buried next to the native people. They told me that they were fierce and all evil and hostile, yet I found them to be some of the most remarkable people, and that's where I want to rest. And some of those wishes were granted. So we find these beautiful moments and stories in that. Is there other stuff? Yeah, probably. That's a very long-winded answer, but it's complex. Life and people are complex. And there's beauty in that sometimes, even in war.
Thank you. I think that was a good answer. The next question is from Mark Carpenter. He says, thank you so much for sharing your difficult and important work. I'm an academic historian working on the history of settler violence and genocide in the Pacific Northwest. And whatever else I might get wrong, I at least have had the right notion on who and what started the Yakama War. This included research into Haller. I wonder if you had a chance to read Haller's 1863 book, where, among other things, he talks about his actions in the Yakama country. I ask in part because his story of what happened changed between his 1856 journal and his sometimes more detailed 1863 book. And I've sometimes struggled to navigate the differences between his narrative of events. What strategies do you use to work through the conflicting pioneer stories, memories, and untruths?
I think whenever looking at history, you come to a point, a very like annoying point. There could be just things that don't align. There could be pieces that are going to always questions that are going to be that are going to remain unanswered. And it grates at you. It's the thing that you're trying to like enjoy your time along the waterfront or a meal, and you just think about it, and you think about those discrepancies, and it just grates you, and you try to work it in your brain and keep working it in your brain and get to that point. And I think that there is a point where you have to acknowledge there might be some discrepancies. There might be some things that don't fully and completely align. But I continually kind of file these questions away. And when I'm able to meet with people that seem to have an understanding or basis of this knowledge, there's just different examples. Like, maybe there was a transcription that was different, or maybe somebody had changed it and added something to it. Different things come into play. That's why I believe so strongly in things like talking to other people that research this on an ongoing basis and trying to see what they have to say about it, the warnings they give about how somebody researches things, or the insight, I should say, not always warnings. Sometimes it's just insight about how somebody researches and their approach, and being aware of that, because when discrepancies come up, you can align that with the information that they've shared, if that makes sense. Humans are not without error or different citation things, but I think I answered that question. There was a number of I think it's strongest when I can hear from the descendants of their relative stories, and they're the ones that tell me that it's incorrect and inaccurate. That validation's already right there for me. I don't have to say it to them and to their face. They're just saying it for me. And then we, co-author articles in the newspaper asking for a 100-year correction to something, which just kind of makes life fun. I mean, I think history and the way we talk about it can come across as boring to some, but you add these other layers into it and you make it, you make it your own. You put your own spin on it. And I think there is, again, complexity that comes with that. I think when people look at my research or what I've done, there's things that they would say, well, why doesn't this align with that? Why doesn't that align with this? And as people and as viewpoints that we hold and positions that we hold in those viewpoints, there are going to be limitations.
Excellent. Another question from Taj Sar. He asked if there's a movie based on the Yakama War.
I have one about the first battle from our Yakama historical account. It's actually, I don't speak in English in that. It's captioned in English. It's a short film called Yakama War Ayat on this first battle. KCTS9 did a little bit of a review in their video, the Yakama War, when I met Glen Hamilton and his family. And I'm not sure if anybody else has done one. I had a great cast, but I actually used more beadwork in my film because I thought about how triggering it could be to some of our tribal members to relive that portion of history. There's still very much emotion that's carried with these war stories, tears that come up in people's mind. Whereas I met Glenn, I can't say that he would be welcomed by other tribal members the way that my family and I had met him.
And another question from Nora Strothman, and she wants to hear your thoughts on the Huller House restoration rehabilitation.
You know, when I was studying that, I'm interested in it. I still want to visit the Haller House to put the answer shortly and sweetly. I wanted to come to Halloween. I talked about it to all my students in college. I was like, if anybody goes, I will accept credit and you summarize it for me. Show me your pictures. It's the best twist on words. I love that kind of thing. So inventive. So that's on my list as well, is to come to Halloween. You know, I watched the videos of it. When I was studying and researching the war, I had actually was at Suquamish, and we were coming back across the water, and my husband had said, "Didn't Haller live in Seattle?" You know, and yeah, at that time we had 3 kids under 5 and stuff was busy. And my idea to meet descendants or to find that was very new. That wasn't something I set out initially. It's just something that just kept coming to my mind. What do the descendants think? What are they told? Is there any oral histories that come up? And I just thought, well, what if there is a house here? Where would it have been at on First Hill? And I went to it. I went to that area and that site, and I took in that spot and I shared it with our people. I just took a picture, like, this is the location of Haller's house in Seattle, and shared a little bit of that history. And that's when I realized, a lot of this isn't talked about in that way. And so then when I found out that there was the Haller house in Whidbey, and I couldn't get enough. I was like looking at things, researching it, seeing that the doorknobs are still the originals because the poor teacher couldn't afford to upgrade anything, which turned out to be like this, wonderful thing in terms of restoration and historic homes. So I want to visit Haller House. I think it's an amazing process. I want to meet Haller descendants. I want to see what they think about my work and about their relative.
It's so that I'm going to just jump in here. That house in Seattle, Haller did very well as a civilian, made a lot of money, and built an 18-room mansion on First Hill in Seattle. It was a big beast of a thing on top of the hill called Castle Mount. No longer there. It's where the parking lot for Swedish Hospital now stands. So I'm sure his humble little house on Whidbey Island still standing is somewhat ironic to him. But I did just want to back up to answer Nora, to address something Nora might be questioning, which is we're restoring this house not as a monument to celebrate manifest destiny or westward expansion or colonization of Native peoples out here. We think that its location and the story that comes with its builder make it a perfect platform for questioning what happened and how we remember it, and how we can train ourselves to remember it in a more just and truthful way. So I relinquish the floor.
Another question. I apologize if I get this person's name wrong. Candace Tachuk. What would you speak to what sustains you in doing this work?
I think that writing the poetry is something that came about as a very organic part of this process, a very natural part of the process. I was finding a hard time transitioning again from the reading researching, writing about historical things, to then, you know, going into everyday life, doing the dishes, cleaning for my family, cooking for my family. And writing the poetry really provided this renewal in me. I also, you know, have utilized this information and this historical information to elevate the MMIW crisis here in Yakima Valley. We have some of the highest missing rates for missing Indigenous people in the entire state of Washington. We have numerous unsolved homicide cases. And so many people were like, well, I didn't know. I was like, you had 165 years to know. We have reports to the president and Congress about the events, a different set of events of natives that were killed. You know, our first report to the US government was 1855. Our second report of MMIW and MMIP, murdered Indigenous people, went to Congress and the president in 1856. The United States has not addressed those reports. And so I've utilized history as this, you know, making this strong point. I can't say that it's always really well thought out. I mean, I think if 7 years ago somebody had told me, you know what, you're going to talk to the White House in a listening session in your little 3-minute segment, and the FBI and the Department of Justice, and you're going to utilize it's going to be a last minute decision because you're in a listening session, and all your notes are going to be from like 4 Post-it notes, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have been freaked out. I would have thought that's crazy. You should have your comments and commentary like well ahead, you know, beforehand typed out. But I think there's honestly this level of authenticity and that you bring forward in this process. For me, I have to stay true to that part of myself. And that if the White House and FBI is going to hear from my Post-it notes, that's what they're going to hear from. And I gain strength from my history. I do have some vulnerability with it, but I do gain strength because it's a really strong point when you can say to the US government that this has been a problem for 165 years and we keep getting told to wait, we'll fix it. Meanwhile, your people are getting taken.
There's a long question. I don't know, Emily, if you can open the chat to read it, or I can certainly read it out loud. It's from Elise Washing.
Oh, my sister's watching. My biggest fan. I have found additional accounts. So the question is, you have shared accounts from Alex Luskin and Haller. Have you found additional historical accounts from the Yakama women and children? There is a elder from our Yakama tribe by the name of Alan Aronica. And I was in a meeting with him talking about some land and maps. And he had just mentioned casually that when he was in high school, as he was passing in the halls, some kids used to say, well, your grandpa killed my grandpa. And then there was numerous professors in the room and they were talking their talk. And I just said, wait a second. Are you telling me that you went to school with the descendants of the Yakama War and that your relatives had killed their relative? And he was like, yeah. So, my idea of meeting descendants is not unique. Other Yakamas have been doing it. And I was like, well, do you still talk to them? How's your relationship? Like, how would that be? He's like, oh, I had coffee with them 2 weeks ago. It was just very casual. But, from his accounts and his mother, Ida Nason Aronica, who was actually born in the 1800s. So we have Yakama members that are living today whose parent was born in the 1800s. That's our connection line. We're one generation removed from the 1800s because of him. So his relative is one of the relatives, Charlie Nason, that went and found those miners and made sure that they wouldn't hurt any other Yakama women or children. And then he ended up going to school with the descendants of those miners. So there's a lot of history with the Kittitas Indians and people, and I continue to try to learn as much as I can from that family and that area.
Emily, I have a more general question for you. I think it was, well, it's been a while now, maybe it was 15 years ago or so. There was a push in the Washington State Legislature to hold, I think it was called a historical court of inquiry about the execution of the Nisqually chief Leschi. And they went back and looked at all the evidence of all the different witnesses, army, militia, civilians. For those who don't know, Chief Leschi was hung for murdering settlers during wartime. He was tried and hung not as a military leader, but as an individual, and was executed by the Washington Territorial Legislature. So here we are, it was 150 years later or close to it when they decided to retry him without the hysteria of the era. And Leschi was officially, formally exonerated by this historical court for the historical record. Is that kind of process something, I was reminded of it when you talked about the complaints from 1856, which the government has never acknowledged. Is that something that should be done more often? Does it help healing for the tribes? Is it something to pursue?
I think so. You know, when I've looked at and tried to reconcile the trauma that our tribal membership has gone through with regards to the war and the impact that it's had on us even today, I've looked at the criminalization of our Native people, our Native men, for standing up for our Yakama women having violence committed against them. And I've often wondered, like, why don't more people speak out, like, are loud about this? And I've referenced Viktor Frankl, who was in the Holocaust, and wrote about his time there in A Man's Search for Meaning. And the part that really stood out to me was he had talked about, you know, getting off of the train into this concentration camp and having everything stripped from him, his work, for those of you that are researchers and historians in the audience, like, having it ripped from his hands, and it's like, that's my work, that's my book, that's what I have. And then having the people ask him, was that, your life, was that your life's work? And it's like, yes. It's like, now you have nothing. And he talks about this very emotional process. And he said, and that was so hurtful, but what hurt the most was watching my fellow Jewish people walk by unmoved, not even really glancing my way, as I'm like losing everything that's been important to me. My family's being separated at that moment. My work is being taken from me. And he said, and then a month later, I was the man in that line, and people were coming off the train, and I was shuffling forward, eyes not meeting theirs. And it really, to me, and regarding this work, it's a symbol of what we have to go through and do to survive. The process and the things that you carry, and that after you've been through a traumatic event, after your people have been through a traumatic event, and the capacity to even do anything other than just survive. So yeah, I think in general, there's a number of pieces and things that we can do to strengthen the voice and bring some element of healing. And I really think it's going to take a number of us. It's not just what I would say about it. It's, what different families have been through and what they would say about that. And the example of the chief, that you brought up is so heartbreaking. And, and I always think of the tribes that had helped us with the Yakama War. It's called the Yakama War but there was other tribes that were involved and that lost a lot. They were in the middle of treaty negotiations sometimes. And that definitely jeopardized their ability to have access to the resources even to this day. And I think about that sacrifice for our people, for our women, to defeat Aller. I mean, that was, I need a little like cha-ching thing there. No.
Thanks. That's great. No, thank you for that. That's important.
Yeah.
Yes, Emily, thank you so much. And now you are committed to coming out here. I think we're going to have a good time. And I have a wild hair that at some time when we can all move around freely again, we should rent a bus and have a field trip and all come out to the Yakama Cultural Center and see you on your own native lands.
Yeah, I mean, the murals are here that have some of the war images on there, which are, pretty graphic. I was like, wow, I couldn't imagine painting that in a day, but they artists made it happen. Art, is a wonderful avenue. I like to see and elevate our Native artists and telling their different stories. My mother's beadwork in this, my poetry. I think that there is a place for Native art and history together.
And let me see, we did have one more question from Elise again. Did you have any ancestors in the Yakama War?
Yeah, so my relative that signed the Treaty of 1855 was somebody that was actively hunted during the war time, because they were really looking for treaty signers during that time, because they knew that they could try to either make an example of them, as we've seen with the horrific killings and hangings of other chiefs that happened at that time. So, they were in hiding. We still haven't disclosed the place that they were in hiding at to this day, 165 years later. And I, even though I know where that's at, I don't publicly state that anytime.
I think that mainstream America has a very, very short memory. And I think we don't like to stay in one place for very long, so we don't have memory of land and history the same way that Native peoples do. Even if your white family has been here since 1855, it's you will never have that kind of historical ancestral connection to the land. And so I think it's a huge chasm in our worldviews, but I'm hoping that we can change that slowly, incrementally, so that maybe 150 years from now, people look back and think, weren't we quaint little warriors trying to save the world?
Yeah, I think, I watched only part of the Vietnam series that was on. And I remember there was one aspect and element that the Viet Cong had shared when they had asked who won the war. And he had, everything that they were saying was translated. So I'm trusting the translation of this since I don't speak that language. But they had said, my relatives died, my friends died. Does that mean I won? He's like, only somebody that's never been to war would ask a question like that. And I try to remember, there was a loss on both sides during this time. And there's still a lot to kind of sort through emotionally. It seems weird, 165 years ago, a historic event, but, there's still a lot of emotion there. And I thank you again for this time and, being online. I kept saying it's an online presentation, but I wish I was on the west side. It's like 100 degrees here.
Yeah, we're wearing sweaters outside right now. The wind is howling. So thanks everybody for attending. It's great to have such a good crowd, an interested crowd, and of course, really special, warm, heartfelt thanks to our friend Emily for really helping us start new dialogue here on Whidbey Island and hopefully far beyond. So good night, everybody. Thank you.